Well, g'day folks, glad you're here. Thank you for joining me on another weekly tutorial as I walk you through the entire Bible in a year. We are 46 weeks in and 2 weeks into our focus on the Apostle Paul. If you're watching these videos live, it's also very close to Christmas, hence the green and red behind me. Hope you don't mind. All right, last week we read Paul's first 3 epistles in chronological order, Galatians and Thessalonians. This week we're reading his 4th letter, which is 1 Corinthians, and I'm going to spend most of my video on 1 Corinthians today. In the narrative, all we're doing is reading Acts 18 and 19, which explains how the Corinthian letter came about, basically, okay? What we're going to see is that in Acts 18, Paul goes to Corinth for the very first time, and unlike other cities that he's been to recently, he gets to stay there for quite a long period of time, about 18 months. So they receive him quite well. The persecutors there don't drive him out of the city like they did in other places. He gets to stay there for a good amount of time, and in doing so gets to establish a strong kind of church community in that city. Well, after a year and a half, he goes down to Jerusalem, back to Antioch, which is his home base, and on his 3rd ministry trip ends up in Ephesus for 2 years. And it's there in Ephesus that he writes back to the Corinthian believers in around about AD 54-55. Timothy takes the letter to them, and so that's where we get the letter of 1 Corinthians. Okay, so there we go. 1 Corinthians is one of those quite controversial letters. Actually, there's a lot of strange passages in there. There's a lot of uncertainties. There's a lot of disagreement. So I want to encourage you as you read Corinthians this week, don't get lost in the detail. Remind yourself of the big picture, and I'm sure you'll get something out of it. I hope this helps. There are 3 things I want to draw your attention to as you read through Corinthians this week, and I hope you enjoy. The first thing is to really pay attention to Paul's relationship with this church and his reason for writing to them. As I said, he's writing from Ephesus about a year and a half or so after he's left them to their own devices. And the reason he writes to them is because they have written to him and they've asked him a bunch of questions. He's got a letter from them. Secondly, people from that church have come to him and asked and said to Paul, look, we're quite concerned about a bunch of stuff that's going in our church. Can you please do something about it? So the whole letter of Corinthians is a response to those issues, those questions, and those concerns. And one after one, chapter after chapter, he deals with each of those issues as a father would address his children. And that's where the relationship thing comes in. I want you to notice, and Paul says this himself. He says, listen, I'm like a father to you in the gospel. So please trust that I have your best interests at heart as I write these things. And like a good father, he applauds them for things they're doing well, and he adjusts them on things that they're not quite doing so well. And so that fatherly heart, like he did with the Thessalonians, he said to them, we were like a mother to you, we're like a father to you. Well, it's the same with the Corinthians. He's not a professional preacher that just came through town to sell a few books and preach a message and leave. No, he is an apostolic father to this church, and that heart really comes out. And I also want you to notice when he writes to them that sometimes he tells them, look, this is God's will in this situation. He's very clear on that. This is God's will. And yet other times he says, look, I'm not actually sure what God's will is, but here's my advice as your dad. Okay, here's my advice, take it or leave it. Here's my advice on this particular matter. And so that's a really good thing, I think, that you can see in Paul. His fatherly heart comes out to them. So pay attention to the relationship he has and the reason that he's writing to them. It's a response to all their issues and concerns. The second thing I want you to pay attention to, and this is a bit fun, is the quotations that Paul uses, all right? Like all the New Testament books we've read so far, the Gospels and Acts and the other epistles, he quotes the Old Testament over and over again. Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Job, Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Hosea all get a mention in this letter. He also quotes Jesus at the Last Supper. He also quotes a Greek poet when he says bad company corrupts good character. Apparently that's a quote from a Greek prophet. He also quotes a rhetorical question when he says, somebody might say, just somebody, how are the dead raised? It's a rhetorical quote. But the main thing I want you to pay attention to is how he quotes the Corinthians back to themselves. Okay, remember I said he's responding to a letter that they had written them. Well, it seems that he takes that letter, quotes that letter back to them, and then gives his answer time and time again. So, for example, they say, listen, everything is beneficial for me. And he says, yeah, but you shouldn't be mastered by anything. They say, the food for the stomach and stomach for food. And he said, yeah, but you need to still exercise self-control. They say, it's good for a man to not marry. And Paul says, well, it can be good, but it can also not be good. Sometimes men should actually marry. And so what he does is he quotes their questions or concerns back to them and then addresses it with his answer. And one of the reasons I bring this up is because one of the controversial things and contradictory things that Paul seems to say in this letter is in chapter 14, where he says women, should not speak in the church. It's disgraceful for women to speak. Which is really confusing because just a couple of chapters earlier, chapter 11, he talks about women praying and prophesying in church. So how can he say that and then a few chapters later say women should not speak? Well, I believe it's because there in 1 Corinthians 14, he's quoting their letter back to them. Someone in that church in Corinth said, women should not speak in church. And that's the quote he's quoting back to them. And then he says this, as you continue to read, he says, excuse me, do you think the word of God originated with you? You should listen to what I teach about women, like in chapter 11. And if anyone wants to ignore what I teach, well, you just ignore him because he doesn't know what he's talking about. So I believe that's what he's doing. It's some of the editors or translators in our Bibles don't put the quotation marks there, but I believe that they should. Because here's the point. In first century Greek writing, they didn't have quotation marks. It's up to our Bible editors to try to suss out where they go. And I think one should go there. I don't think Paul himself is saying women should not speak. I think he's responding and quoting their letter back to him. The point is simply this. Not every word spoken in this or written in this letter is from Paul. He sometimes quotes their teaching or their, beliefs back to them as he gives his explanation. I'm sure that'll make sense as you work your way through. Okay, the last thing I want you to pay attention to, what is it? Is Paul's main theme through the letter. So he deals with a heap of issues, but as I see it, there is one underlying theme that goes literally from beginning to end. And it's basically this. It's the relationship between the individual and the collective. Okay, the relationship between the individual and the body, or the temple, or the group, or the community, or the church. And Paul, from beginning to end, that theme I can see working through. So in the opening chapters, when he talks about being divided, he says, look, as individuals, you're dividing up of your favorite preachers. You need to be unified as a group. And the only way that will happen is when you focus on Jesus and Jesus only. When he talks about sexual sin and some of them getting divorced and taking one another to court, he says, listen, these individual decisions don't just affect you. They have a negative effect on the whole group. So please deal with those issues and don't let it get to that. When he talks to them in chapter 8 through to 10, he says, listen, as individuals, you might have personal liberties and rights, but at times it is wise for the sake of the collective to relinquish those rights for the sake of the group. When he talks about church meetings, he says, listen, every one of you might have something to contribute, but when it comes to what is best for the group, it needs to be done in an orderly way that's going to benefit everyone. So this theme constantly comes through. And of course, the underlying theology in that is that individuals don't just come to Christ on their own. Well, they do. You have an individual relationship with Jesus, but when you do, you are baptized or become part of a collective group, a covenant community. And he says it's the same thing that happened in the first Exodus with Moses, okay? Those people came out of Egypt, and when they came through the Red Sea, they were baptized into the body of Moses. They were baptized into Moses, into a Moses community. And so again, he makes this distinction between covenant communities, the community of Moses, the collective body of Moses, and the community of Christ. So I want you to notice this. And the interesting thing is this mindset of the individual and the collective, the individual's relationship with the collective, even goes into his teaching on the resurrection, because he says, how are the dead, those individual dead, raised? In what body do they come? They come into a resurrected body, not resurrected bodies. Okay, those individuals do not have their own resurrected bodies. Those individuals are raised in a collective body that is immortal and imperishable. Well, at least that's one theory about what he's talking about there. You can look at that yourself. Just don't get too lost in the details, all right? Finally, a couple of last things as you read this letter. Please understand this is very important. When you read Corinthians, it's like we are listening to one way one part of a two-way conversation, all right? We can hear what Paul's saying, but we don't really know what the Corinthians are asking. We don't really know what's truly happening in that church. We're kind of left to try to piece it together. So some things seem a little uncertain to you. That's why you're listening to a two-way conversation, but you're only hearing one part of it. And so that's why it can be a little confusing at times. The second thing is, while he deals with a whole bunch of issues, his intent is not to give a comprehensive theology on all of those areas, because remember, it's a response letter. And so he leaves a lot of things unsaid. After all, he's just spent a year and a half teaching them, hour after hour after hour, day after day after day, week after week after week. He taught them heaps of stuff. This letter is just a snapshot to respond to some of the questions they have. So, we can't develop big theologies just out of this letter. That's not the point of it. It is a response letter to him. And so if you leave this letter with questions, that's absolutely fine. It's not there to answer every question, dot every, I and cross every T. That's not the purpose of it. It's a response letter. And lastly, I want you to realize as you read through Corinthians this week that essentially you and I are reading somebody else's mail. This letter was not addressed to Bayside Church in the 21st century. It was written to the Corinthian church in the year 54-55 AD. And so many of the things that he talks about specifically have very unique application for that church. Things like head coverings and food sacrificed to idols. These are cultural issues from Corinth that are coming out in their experience. However, behind each of those specific examples is a general truth that you and I can definitely learn from, whether it's God's will being expressed or whether it's Paul's fatherly wisdom and advice coming through. You are definitely going to take some things away from this letter this week and find application for them in your own life. All right. So enjoy Corinthians this week. If you can read it in one sitting, do so. It's quite a long letter. You might want to take 2 or 3, but remember, read big chunks at a time. And then of course, follow his journey in Acts 18 and 19. Next week, we've got a couple more epistles, but I really hope you enjoyed this week. Bless you heaps, and I'll see you then. Bye.